Okay, so we continue the discussion. We have the first. Okay, so we continue the discussion. We have the first session after the presentation of the study Restoring the Balanced Digital Competition, and now we're going into concrete details of the proposals of the European Commission. And this will be the first digital try, so to say, because not everybody could make it to travel to Berlin. And I'm also happy that I see Paul, Louis Crofts also with us, and Oli from Google. We have with us Wolfgang from Deutsche Telekom, the senior vice president. We have Andreas Schwab, the representative of the EPP in the European Parliament. And of course, we have Rebecca in charge of privacy and competition issues in the biggest digital association, so to say, in Germany. I'm right. So these ex-ante initiatives arises from a range of concerns, which, according to the Commission, may lead to risk of reduced social gains from innovation and large-scale unfair trading practices. We have three options on the table by the Commission. They're quite clear. What do they want to achieve in the coming period? So one option was simply to revise the P2B regulation, although this regulation is almost already went into effect, so to say, a couple of weeks ago. Then the second option was collecting of data from large platforms by dedicated regulatory body. And these options would not include any power to impose remedies. And the third option has two supplemented variations, so to say, for gatekeepers, where gatekeepers would be identified by yet to be agreed set of criteria. And the two sub-options are blacklisting or tailor-made remedies. So we have a clear picture where what are the possible options on the table, and my first question probably goes to Wolfgang. I remember while I was working for Deutsche Telekom, even 2012, that you were raising the issue of level playing field in Europe. As we could see, how many years later we have finally reached the momentum, and we have some concrete options. What's your comment on this, and do we really have enforcement gap?
Well, I think if we look at what has been discussed in a previous panel, it is absolutely clear that we do have this gap. And as you know, I'm coming from antitrust competition law, and I'm doing this now for 27 years. And if I look at all the attempts of competition authorities to really handle these issues we are looking at only with competition law, I have to say this will not work in the future. And if you then go into more of the details and look also at what we here heard on the economic side of these markets, I mean, we have already a lot of experience with regulating network effects and most of the detrimental effects we are observing are stemming from network effects. We have a lot of experience in keeping innovation at life, but withdrawing the power of single companies regulating entire ecosystems. What I'm talking about? I mean, I'm talking about energy regulation, I'm talking about the regulation our companies are subject to. And if you then look at what is the proposal here, both from the EU Commission, but also in this extremely well-written study. I think this is one of the first studies I have read, and I'm observing this subject matter now, as you said, for a long time, which really goes into the subject heart of the what to do and how to regulate. If you then look at these issues the study also raises, you can say it's very, very simple in a way, because the basic principles in order to get grip on network effects are also addressed in this study. It's non-discrimination, it's access, it's interoperability. And then you can derive a lot of other proposals, what is to-dos and not to-dos, from that. So I think the idea of really now having a blacklist, as it is called, and having a framework regulation above with some very basic principles, and a lot of discretion on the side of the enforcing agencies is a good one. Because I don't believe that any of these companies will ever go to rules that are really favoring the market. I mean, this self-regulation is, to me, a pretext to avoid enforcement and to delay all legislation. And we can easily go also into examples, but I stop for the moment here.
Okay, many thanks. The whole discussion must go through the European Parliament. I believe and I hope that all these proposals were made in close collaboration with the European Parliament, and you are the strong protagonist of these new approaches by the European Commission. I believe you support this move into more strict rules when it comes to platform economy and new enforcement rules. What's your perception on this? How do you see the need for new competition tools, the new ex-ante tool at European level?
Well, thank you so much for this invitation. I think this is a great conference, and you have been asking at the beginning that there are 3 ways to do it, and the most likely way is for sure to focus on the biggest part of the problems, which are the gatekeepers. But I would like to avoid very common behavior at the time now, that we only speak badly about these companies. I think we have to admit they have brought a very high level of innovation.
Indeed.
And they are great companies. But we have to see that they are shareholder driven. And as there are only, in brackets, only competition rules, they know that they can try to work out tools and strategies, as you have called it for the conference, that the winner takes it all. And that is definitely not our view how markets should work. Now, it's true, because you have been asking about the 3 options, it's true that there are smaller players at the moment that could also become big players and could also try to be the winner that takes it all. And we want to avoid that. But we also have to make sure that those who have already taken large parts of the market can be better framed. And for that, we haven't found any clear solution. Since the European Commission has started procedures against these companies that I won't name, they have not suffered. They have been getting stronger. So I think these companies are too strong for system, for an ecosystem where innovation is the key driver for the market, where service is the key driver. It has become a market where market size and company size is driving, and that's not our point of view how markets should operate. And I would like to tell you that when I was some years ago in France at the Conseil d'État for a similar discussion, I was impressed how the French have explained me why the German approach to competition policy has a very strong historical root, and we have fought against the big companies in Germany after the Second World War because we didn't want to have any more oligopolies that not only destroy markets but also political approaches. And we should be very careful repeating stuff that has been done in the past, but I still believe that innovation and incentives for people to work hard to have a success is much easier and much fairer devised in a country if you have SMEs and small companies instead of one or two big companies. So it's also in a certain way a genetic reflection in the CDU to make sure that the market is as large as possible and the companies are not too big. Therefore, I think we have to focus on gatekeepers in a way which allows them to operate also fairly in the future, because they have done enormous innovations. And that's because we are now delaying that and delaying it and delaying it. It's getting bad because the left is now going against these companies for other reasons as well, apparently for tax issues, even if the tax rules are done by the member states. It's not the companies who misuse, it's the member states who are not managing this. So there is plenty of questions around, and I think we should also help these companies in a certain way to be competitive, to remain there, but with a better ruling that they can also be better, explained to the shareholders that drive their strategies to a large extent.
But you have heard also Philip Marsden saying maybe they should change also their business model, and that won't be an easy issue, I believe. From the point of view of a biggest digital association, do you see any enforcement gap, Rebecca?
I think we have to differentiate between a law perspective and a policy perspective when answering that question, because we do have competition rules that are against unfair competition and misuse of power, of course, and they are enforced. What we do see is that the procedures take incredibly long, and that seems to be an issue. So I think it is great that this is addressed in the recent proposals, in the DSA, so in the Digital Service Act, and in the NCT as well, so the new competition tool. We do have to be careful, I guess, with regard to how to speed the process up, because if it tips the balance in a way that we do speed the process up, but on the other hand we lose due process, then I think that's not an outcome we do want. So I would say we need to address that issue, of course, and what we also have to look at is the policy agenda that is behind the apparent enforcement gap, if you want to put it that way. Because I think what we all want, from all the different perspectives that are in this room and in this discussion we have had for quite a few years now, is we want to enable German and European companies to grow. We want them to be competitive to these large platforms, whether they are gatekeepers or whether they are just large. And what we do see in the current proposals, especially on the European level, is that they seem to be targeted at a few companies, but not really considering all, or maybe the ripple effect that new competition rules might have for smaller platforms as well. So I think especially addressing the first policy option, so making or revising the P2B regulation could be an issue here, because it's quite horizontal, so it's addressing all the platforms, so it would be new rules for all the platforms, and I don't really think that would close any enforcement gap there is. What we have been discussing also with regards to enforcement is whether we really need new rules, so new prohibitions for maybe gatekeepers. what the EU Commission failed to do until now, and I really hope that they will deliver on this, is concrete definitions and concrete, factors that make a gatekeeper. Because if the definition is too broad, then of course we're regulating companies that we really didn't want to address. We saw this with the GDPR. I think it was also targeted at some companies, at least with regards to some articles in there. And we are seeing how that turned out.
So let's continue with our first digital try with Paul. I really enjoyed reading his report for the Dutch government, also named Gatekeeper Platform Regulations. And there is one interesting aspect in your report when it comes to effectiveness and efficiency of the new rules. How do you consider this proposal of the European Commission, Paul?
In the panel, and let me dive right into also what we found in the report. So it was a joint work with my fellow economist Nicolai van Gorp, with whom I cooperate a lot on digital platforms. So the ministry asked us to figure out what is a digital gatekeeper and what type of regulation would be necessary. So we wrote an independent report. It hasn't been followed up in full extent because the ministry has its own considerations. And I understand that they have considerations because there is this big unease about the size of digital platforms and the sort of power imbalance, I guess. But what we looked at in particular was, does it make sense or is it possible to define a digital gatekeeper? Because that would be the basis for regulation. And our viewpoint is that, well, the main problem, at least if you restrict yourself to competition issues, is that a gatekeeper can be a platform that applies discriminatory practices with an anti-competitive impact. And what we then derive is that you don't really have to define what gatekeeper is, because we just are thinking about digital platforms, whatever they are doing. And if a digital platform is vertically integrated and if it discriminates, then there may be a problem. And the problem is due to the fact that the anti-competitive effects may outweigh the efficiency motives or the pro-competitive motives that may be present. And I think this is what matters. So it's not so much the size of a company in itself. Well, that may be problematic for other reasons, but if you just think about competition issues, then it's not the absolute size, but the relative importance of a platform to behave in a dominant way and abuse its position with an overall anti-competitive impact. And this provides some clues regarding to how you can work with this from a policy perspective. So of course you can work with an ex-ante instrument, but you may also supplement competition law with guidelines describing how competition authorities can infer dominance from market behavior, in particular from discrimination by a vertical integrated platform. Because if a vertically integrated platform discriminates, then by implication it is dominant. So that's sort of the key idea that we develop and that we then use to compare the effectiveness of ex-ante regulation with a competition policy approach supplemented with guidelines that allow for quick intervention.
Many thanks, Paul. Let's continue with Oli. Oli, are you with us? Hopefully also from Brussels. O.Bethell.
I am. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
We can listening to you, not watching you here in the room, but we can listening to you quite well.
Okay.
Strange question. How do you feel as a gatekeeper?
That's a very good question. It's a good thing you can't see the video as I lead.
Now we see you, so it's even the full effect is in the room.
Yeah, good. That's good. Well, thank you very much. I'm glad the video came. As you asked that question, Penjo. Thank you, everyone, for having me this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually in London. How do you feel as a gatekeeper? In my company, in my part of the company, optimistic, which is going to sound like a strange thing to say, I think, this evening, given some of the commentary. Although I found this evening very interesting and very constructive in turn, I must say. But optimistic, I think, for a number of reasons. I think that one of the things that strikes us, I mean, we can talk about, my fellow panelists here and others this evening have talked a lot about, I don't need to talk about the value of the value creation of technology firms, the dynamism of the market. Those things have already been mentioned well, I think, by my colleagues. Nor do I really need to get into the details of some of the enforcement action that you're already seeing around gatekeeper companies and how this sort of works in parallel, complements the discussion that we're having here today. I think those points have also been very well made. I do think those are important connected ideas to the notion of gatekeeper legislation. But I feel optimistic for this reason, because as a company that is often invited to talk on these panels and is often referenced in these well-written, rigorous documents that we're discussing tonight in other contexts, it is patently obvious that there is a good and constructive motivation behind the discussion around how we can innovate in legislation. You cannot be working, in my view, for a company that presents itself as an innovator, a value creator, a fast-moving, dynamic company, and not expect the rules to also be dynamic and innovative and fast-moving. And I think that's where my optimism comes from, is that this is an effort for the rules to develop alongside these fast-moving technologies. I do think there are a couple of observations that we have, as you said, as one of the companies that's often referenced here. I think there are sort of two clusters of questions that we discuss within the company when thinking about ex-ante legislation regulation. The first is, and this is really not for us, to be clear, this is not a question for Google to answer, but what is the policy objective? What ultimately is the vision for these new rules? We hear different variants of that. I think that's an important debate. I think that the paper that Philip and Rupert have just published is an important practical step forward there, and it asks a series of questions that we have been wanting to hear and to discuss. You know, how do we want these markets to operate? Where are the trade-offs between innovation and legislation? Where should we draw the line between the idea of curation and misleading consumers? We need to move that debate forward, and I think there are a lot of very interesting questions that are now being answered, particularly in this paper that we discussed this evening. The other area, and then I'll get off the mic. The other area where there are interesting questions for us within Google are around the process, the procedural questions that are now, again, in a very pragmatic and constructive way, I believe, in this paper being discussed. What kinds of tools are we going to now give agencies to ask the right kinds of questions of me and my team? You know, what kinds of data analytics, what kinds of research organizations do we need to have within the institutions to be able to ask the right questions and analyze the answers quickly and effectively? How does that translate into practical guidance? Just very quickly, Pencho, on this. I think that, just to pick up this point on self-regulation, from my perspective, limited as that is, it is something of a spectrum. I take the point well. I think it's very reasonable to be somewhat cynical when you think about the notion of self-regulation writ large. If self-regulation is a justification for not doing anything in the space, I share that cynicism. I understand that reaction. The version of self-regulation that I think we should be cognizant of as we think about how we discuss what these rules ought to look like is this. Within the in-house function, we self-regulate on a day-to-day basis. We look at the rules, we look at the guidance, and we apply that to the product decisions that we see. And it's important for that to feature and I think to contribute to the debate, because we can be much closer to the product decisions on my team. We are closer to those decisions to launch, to iterate, to change products. And I think self-regulation, effective self-regulation, is where you marry that kind of on-the-ground guidance to engineers with tools that give you a clear sense of the policy objective and practical and pragmatic guidance. And that, I think, is the form of self-regulation that I think is possible in this environment. That's too much. Thank you, Benja.
Many thanks. So let's go into this direction, fairness of process and fairness of outcome. The outcome could be unfair, but that's not the objective of the competition law, so to say, at the end of the day. What do we want to achieve by this new possible regulatory step at European level?
Well, I could give in a very recent example. I had the honor in my company to co-lead the development of the Corona Warn app. And if you look at the small history of Corona warning apps in Europe, you see a striking example how big the market power of Google and Apple is, and how small even the power of countries like France is. Because what happened in the beginning of this development, the direction was let's have a centralized app which is also interoperable throughout Europe, and let's develop something which is open source, and compatible with GDPR. So what happened? Everybody started developing. In Germany, I think there were 20 companies developing in parallel. In between, Google and Apple teamed up and told everybody, by the way, we are controlling the Bluetooth application. And the Bluetooth application was the thing where you can measure the distance and also the time you're sitting. And that's the very essence of a Corona warning app in the beginning, this measurement. And by the way, we do not accept centralized apps. The French government said, well, we don't care. We want to have a centralized app. The API published was of no value to anybody who was developing this centralized app. They had to do extract coding for the Bluetooth. And that's the very heart of the failure of the French app, which doesn't work, which takes away most of the power in the phone. So everybody who was trying to develop an app was then relying on Google and Apple. And then the game started. You had to address them whether you could measure within 15 minutes how many times in order to get a correct measurement. That needed, I think, at least in Germany, every week escalations on CEO level, even with the Chancellor's office. Otherwise, it wouldn't have worked. If you then look what they provided for as an API, and which was used then in Switzerland as the first measurement, the accuracy of that API was 20%. So 80% of all measurements were crap. I mean, that's nothing you can provide to a German customers. So we were in a situation 2 weeks before launching, what are we doing? And then we set up our own laboratories, calibration, had exactly coding they didn't want. We escalated again. In the end, we had 90% accuracy. Funny thing is, shortly after, they took it and they're now selling it in the US. Yeah? Same system. It's developed by Fraunhofer and SAP and Deutsche Telekom. And I mean, if I look at this, and no company and no government has really the power to force them and to make this easy. And if you then talk to German startup communities about their behavior in the app stores, I mean, there were plenty of cases before the last Football World Championship where we had very nice apps, which were just delayed until after the whole championship took place. If you then ask the guys, why didn't you complain? Well, we have other apps running and we don't risk any complaint. And Brussels does not enforce. I think we need, for such reasons, we need ex-ante regulation, we need clear rules for operating systems, we need clear rules for other systems, because also I don't believe in the dynamic part. I mean, if you have a market share of 90% in one market, like search, for 20 years, what is dynamic in this market? Sorry to say, yeah, that's a stable monopoly. And we are facing this in other parts, and that's why I'm believing against my own beliefs on regulation, because I always believed in competition law instead of regulation, that only ex-ante regulation can help here.
Only ex-ante regulation can help. Andreas, the same question to you. What do we want really to achieve? I believe the pressure also on the member of parliament is really high, because the people are really expecting some new wind in the digital sphere in Europe. They are asking, why do we have such a strong monopoly position in many couple of fields, and they expect that you should correct this market failure, but by some new rules. What do we want to achieve? Fairness of outcome or fairness of process?
I think we want to achieve fairness of the outcome and of the process. But we don't want to create problems for innovation. And I think that was the point of Bitkom, saying that if we go for too much regulation...
You believe that this kind of regulation maybe could affect also the innovation of Google one day?
Honestly speaking, I use Google every day, but I'm not concerned that much about their level of innovation. I rather care about the small newcomers in the market that want to look for their chance and have one good idea and are too much dependent on a few companies, on everything. And we should not now go into too many of the details. I think there are some examples that can show to you that these companies are extremely big, they look extremely strong, but maybe they are not that convinced themselves about their strengths. I'm always wondering, I think in these new times, it's much more transparent, everything. I think when an old automotive company was 25 years ago changing the supply chain, there were some specialists doubting, but it's not open to the public at the time. Now it's open to the public. So if you take your phone, and everyone has a phone nowadays, more or less, you see exactly the uncompetitive behavior that is there. I don't understand why a company that is so innovative needs to spend 2 billion euros every year just to be on the main screen with the search function. I don't really understand that. If the search is as good as it's told, I wouldn't spend that money for it. I don't understand how it can be that you replace the music function on the phone that has already been in another app, and you integrate the app into yours and you sell it as yours. I mean, there is so much incoherence that is showing that maybe the strength is not as strong as a lot of people believe. That's a problem. But we have also another problem. Our public, and I think my predecessor was explaining that very well, the problem is that the public is overly concerned with data protection and privacy. And these new companies, they are not that so new anymore, but these companies have a much more modern approach to convince people to give up their data. I think people know that they have already given their data to them, but now with the rules that we have done, people are rather reluctant to share the data with other companies. And that's a problem, which is not the problem of these companies, of the big ones. It's the problem of our public and the misconception they have. And I think we have to work out several things. What we want to have is more fairness, a level playing field where newcomers into the market have a real chance, not only to be economically independent and to have a certain choice with what partner they want to cooperate, but also to win over with their product in a market. And that, for the moment, is not possible.
Many thanks also for the great examples, supporting the thesis that we need ex-ante clear rules in this respect. Rebecca, Andreas also mentioned we have like constant situation on the market. We have stable market share also on many different fields. How do you consider this as a market failure that must be corrected, or maybe because of the specifics of the network economy, we should simply get over and focus on different issues?
I think the examples that have been raised just now by you both are excellent examples to show that we have a new kind of market power nowadays. The share platforms can have in one market or in several markets if they're integrated. is something we haven't seen before. And I think that we do also see that it isn't maybe properly addressed in the competition law we have now. What we also see, and that coming back to your question whether we need procedural fairness or fairness of outcome, is that I do agree that we need both. We do need process to be fair. We do need competition law as a law itself to work properly, to be enforced properly. But we also need a fairness of outcome. And I think that is something competition law itself cannot achieve nowadays, because the law needs to be as integrated as the company, as the companies it's trying to address. And I think we have to accept the fact that we do need like a holistic approach to the law, and to really intertwine all the regulatory efforts here. So with the GDPR, with the new competition law, with special telco regulation that is also addressing the platforms soon with the EECC. And I think that's a new approach we have to take. I think that is also something that Ruprecht mentioned in an article he recently published, that we need some boldness with regards to our regulatory approaches. And we do really need to learn from what the GDPR didn't achieve. We can't make the same mistakes twice. And I think that's a clear message to you, Andreas, and to everyone in Brussels, that we saw great regulation coming with the GDPR. It's a great piece of work, but it's also a piece of work. And we can't do that twice. And I think overregulation in a competition law context would stifle innovation in the end. Maybe it will also stifle Google's innovation. I don't know, maybe even innovation in other companies. Well, it would definitely be a hurdle for other companies to thrive in Europe. And I think that's the policy aim we really want to achieve here.
That's my favorite part, among others, in the study of Ruprecht and Philip, where they really call upon the experiences with the GDPR in the actual context. Interestingly, I'm not alone in this moderation. I have my co-moderator in Brussels. Unfortunately, Louis couldn't make it, and really enjoys his regular tweets on competition matters every day. If I ask you to support me, Louis, what questions or comments you have for our speakers?
Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you see me? Excellent. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm sorry I can't be there, and I've supplied some questions to Pencho, who's asked them with infinitely more charm and less aggression than I would have done if I was in the room. So thanks for that. The question which is sort of on my mind when I look at these, some leaks have been going around the last couple of days on this gatekeeper legislation, is it seems very much to target GAFA, the big four. We've talked about that, and Philip Marsden earlier talked about changing business models. But it seems to me that the only thing that unites these companies is they're just really, really big. They've got completely different business models, from monetized through data, or monetized through advertising, or monetized through devices, or retail markups, or whatever. And that business model would be a very big part of the analysis in a competition case. But it seems here that the business models are all lumped together in this legislation. I was just wondering if anyone on the panel thought that the differing business models should play a role. They usually would play a big role in how we would remedy conduct, and how the outcome we would seek from a prohibition. How do we match the different business models together in a piece of legislation which applies so broadly?
Really difficult question. Who would like to answer? Also, I mean, it's common for all these companies that they don't have common business model. They rely their business model on data to a significant extent. But of course, there are some common grounds. But you're definitely right. We try to frame a new framework, but to address basically different business models. Yeah.
I think that's an excellent point, because platforms do work differently, and they have different business models, and regulation should account for that. But I think, and I think that is also why we're talking so much about that in a competition law context, because that's where we address certain behaviors. And regardless of what the concrete business model is, if you're applying certain behaviors in the market, then we can address that with competition law. So I think it's a good starting point there. But we do have to keep in mind that they do work differently, and there are different mechanisms at place, and there are large dependencies also from other markets and following markets. Which brings me back to the point that over-regulation might stifle innovation, but I already said that.
Okay, thanks. Wolfgang, please.
Yeah, I mean, there's one thing which is also common to GAFA, or maybe Fangman, and that they already took the market. The winner takes it all, at least in big parts of the markets they operate. When I started, I was mentioning some principles how to regulate network effects. Why did they take the market? It was due to network effects. It's usually a two-sided market, and on the one side of the market, the network effect makes them to the winner. And in network industries, we have these principles now they were developed in the US, I think, 80, 90 years ago, and implemented in Europe 30, 40 years ago. And it's, first of all, it's access, it is non-discrimination, it is, in many cases, interoperability. By such principles, you are already addressing most of the problems. If you then come to a lower level, and that is the nice thing of this study, you're having different behaviors, but many of them, as Judith just said, I mean, the effect is the same. Competition law already has developed a big body of law to address the behavior. Yeah? If you're looking at much of this behavior, it's leveraging. There's leveraging jurisprudence in the US for 120 years. Yeah? In Europe, at least in Germany, leveraging exists since the 70s. Yeah? I mean, that's nothing new. It must be just applied. And I think if we do it in a mixture of ex-ante rules, where we really define what is already harmful, and then look at these classical things, and that's the attempt, I understand the EU now. And let me say one word, what you also mentioned. I think the new competition tool can only be very carefully applied. Because if it's applied to all other industries, as it is now drafted, then we are doing a lot of harm to many other industries. To me, it was only designed for these special problems. The EU now seems to take a broad approach, which where I agree is we should be careful.
Andreas, do you believe we can find a common approach in the transatlantic relations? I mean, you probably remember really the fantastic hearing in the Congress like a couple of weeks ago. It was really impressive. And it seems they have the same objective, but I'm not sure they are going to legislate the way we do.
Well, I mean, first of all, it's a bit of a problem that two of our panelists are not here. We see them from time to time on the screen. I'm sure they could also contribute something. Secondly, we are speaking about tools that we don't know the content about. So we are speaking about DSA, we are speaking about new competition tool, but no one really knows what's in there. So we are quite imprecise on this. And that is exactly the biggest challenge. We have all a feeling what at the moment in the market is unfair, and it's the others. And like that, it's very good. Mr. Kopf has mentioned it should only be on some companies, not on the others. So I think that will not work. It has to be a very clear logic behind any legislation that is done. And like that, the wording of ex-ante tool is already a little bit misleading because it can only be rules. And if these rules are broken, there will be an ex post procedure to create damages. But what in any event will change or can change the situation is that if we have not 27 different market authorities around, with 27 plus 16 data officers around, and whatever people around. But if we can create one strong authority, we would have maybe also a different negotiation tool with all companies in the world, not only with them. But obviously also we don't want to fall into a direction of planning economy or big authority deciding what markets are like. That's a very big danger. We want to have a market economy that operates independently of any intrusion of authorities, but where there are some key values maintained. And these key values, unfortunately, are not maintained at the moment. And that's our problem. So we should expect the Commission in the new competition tool to come up with ideas how intelligently create rules for all platforms that are not overburdening them, and some special rules for companies from after a certain size, on top of a certain size, and them being controlled by or in touch with by the European authority, by the European Commission, in a different manner than the European Commission at the moment is running behind them with DG Comp. They are doing a good job, but this is too slow. This is too late, and this is not enough to make sure that we keep the market innovative and to give the chance also to small companies to survive and not being bought and then being integrated or being deleted. And that's a challenge which is more difficult than we have been addressing so far, because in a legal terms, it's extremely complex to manage to fix exactly these problems.
Regarding the level playing field, thanks for the remark. I'm trying to give proportionate time to everybody. And of course, the next question go to Paul and to Olli. Paul, you even you have spoken in your report of alternatives to our current proposals that we have on the table. What is your comment on this?
Yeah, but let me frame my comment in response to the previous discussion, which was
that's possible.
Triggered by your question. It was triggered by your question about should we aim at fairness of process or fairness of outcome, and this led to a discussion in which Mr. Kopf proposed to use principles like interoperability, access, and so on. And here I would like to take a step back, because I'm not sure if I fully agree with that point of view. And I think a key point in these markets is that, innovation goes quite fast. So market boundaries are in a constant state of flux, and business models change all the time, and there's rapid technological change. Also, in innovation in business models. So what we observe is that firms challenge each other across market boundaries and across value chains of a very different nature. And this is what you want to sort of stimulate. So I tend towards an approach based on process, because these fast changes in technology and in business models and in market boundaries will make it sort of unavoidable that you aim at the process, because if you aim at the market outcome, you are, I think, aiming at a mirage. So protecting the process of dynamic competition and entry possibilities is of the highest importance, and we should then, of course, also take a more critical look at takeovers made by big tech companies, so looking at killer acquisitions and so on, to make sure newcomers all the time have chances to challenge established companies by disrupting their value chains, so by becoming a new intermediary or by disintermediating the existing value chains. So that's, I think, the best we can hope for, because otherwise, well, these markets are quite different than the telecoms market, than the energy market, than the postal markets where we have learned so much about regulation. So this requires, I think, a different approach, aiming at the possibility that established companies can be challenged at all times. So that's what I wanted to insert as a comment here.
Clear message. I believe Olli supports your view. What's your view on this, Olli?
We've covered a very interesting topics.
Maybe come back to my previous issue. Do you feel that maybe your innovation will be affected by this move? And you see our worries. I mean, basically, we are confronted with the stable position of GAFA, and what would be the alternative for more competitive process in Europe?
I mean, my any concern I have about a constraint on Google's innovation prospectively is not a reason to block new regulation, right? I mean, the Google saying that it's an innovative company, Google pointing to the things that we're doing to create new ecosystems, that is not a justification for ending this discussion, by no stretch. I think what troubles me more is the fact that at this point in the debate, that there are different, to come back to the earlier very good question for what is the vision, where are we trying to go with this? There are different versions of that, it seems to me, in the debate. There's a vision which looks at the market and says that the winners have taken all. I'm not happy with that. So the outcome that I would like to see would be more search engines. I would like to see the GAFA companies in less dominant positions. That's the outcome I'm striving for. There is another vision which looks at those companies and says they have a collection of attributes, shared attributes. We can point to certain things, the presence in citizens' day-to-day lives, the fact that they're networks, the fact that there are matching systems underlying a lot of these platforms. There are similarities. These platforms are very important. We need to pay attention to them. Moving beyond that, we accept that there are differences. The business models are very different. So as we start to look more carefully at these important platforms and how we want them to behave in the future, we need to be able to conceive of, I think it's quite reasonable to discuss places where there may be a harm that is so obvious on its face. Looking across platforms, we would want to prevent that. There's an example in Rupert and Philip's paper, I think, around a sort of naked attempt to choose profitability over relevance, right? Product innovation sacrificed on the altar of profitability. I think if you see that kind of behavior, there's an argument for per se rules that would help people move more quickly. I also think, however, that we are going to see a lot of case-by-case analysis, and this was something that President Mudd mentioned in his remarks. It is very difficult. I have worked on the shopping case for some years, almost the best part of a decade now, and it is very difficult to get two people in the room who agree on what self-preferencing is. That is a fact. Is the notion of leveraging a substandard product to get ahead of your competitors troubling and something we should pay attention to? Absolutely. But we need to have the kind of mechanisms that allow us to do that in a sensible and evidence-based way. So I think that, for me, just to sort of dodge your question a little bit, I'm sorry, but I think that we do need to keep coming back to this vision, or an agreed vision for what the future looks like. It's competition on the merits, I think. It's not a particular outcome. We're not looking for distribution of traffic in particular ways. We're looking for a competitive environment where the best products win. But I do think it's important to be clear on that ultimate goal if we're going to have a sensible and practical way of achieving it.
I think we have a problem with the time. Before I ask you for really just 1 minute comment at the end, do we have maybe one question in the audience that really would like to address some specific aspect of the current proposals on the table that we have by the Commission? I don't see any voices. Maybe I can ask at the end Luis to make some final comments on our panel, and now the final remarks by Wolfgang.
Oh.
Just 1 minute. What's on your mind? I mean, we have exchanged our views, and what would be your recommendation in this process, maybe to the European Commission? And I mean, we are in the time of the presidency, and we are so basically we can abuse our position, so to say.
I found it very interesting what Bill said. I mean, I think it's less of process versus outcome. In the end. It is what President Mudd said. It's about we are tackling the harm, and whether we should then really distinguish between process and outcome. That clearly, to me, makes no sense. I think we need to tackle these issues, and I agree. I mean, not everything which was used in my industry can be used for that industry, but there are, in these studies are more principles, yeah, and that's why I like the study and I like the discussion. So, thank you for inviting me.
Andreas, your final comments on.
Well, I mean, the concept of fairness is something which is a very broad concept to my point of view, and that's what we would like to apply, but we want to avoid at the same time a bureaucratic overkill. And we want to avoid a lot of other issues, and to combine that in the right manner, that will be an extremely difficult task. And referring to the DSA and NCT doesn't fix that problem. We have to look what will be written in, how we can define gatekeepers seriously and all this. And that's a task for the European Commission to be done.
Many thanks. Rebecca, and then we continue with Paul, and once again, Oli, and the final remarks by Luis.
I think we already talked enough about the issues that arise from the NCT and the DSA not being concrete enough at the moment. So I think one point that can't be stressed enough is whatever we do with competition law, it won't help German and European companies thrive if there isn't enough funding and the regulatory framework as a whole, so the holistic approach again, that really enables them to grow. Because what we do want to see at the end of the day is a European champion, I think. And for that, we need a holistic approach.
I was trying to avoid the term, but when you say it, then okay. Let's continue with Paul.
Yes, thank you. So the key issue, I think, that's on the table is the ex-ante regulation instrument. And I agree with the problem diagnosis and the risk of harm to consumers and to competition. But in our study, we point at a different way that could be more effective. So supplementing an ex-post competition law approach with a quick way for competition authorities to use guidelines to quickly infer abuse of dominance just by looking at market behavior without having to do a market analysis, a market definition. So I'm in general very much in favor of regulation if it helps consumers and competition. But in this case, I'm a little bit afraid that it will generate a lot of work, not only for regulators, but also for companies and politicians.
Thanks, you clear message. Oli, what would be your final remark after our discussion?
I remain optimistic, to pick up from my opening.
But it was in the beginning. Are you still optimistic?
I remain optimistic. I'm even more so. I mean, I think these are all... Look, what's important from my perspective, again, I speak as one person, but from my perspective, what's important at this moment is that the questions, Andreas has asked this several times, the practical questions about what the language says and what it will require when the rubber hits the road, if you forgive me that American expression, is crucial. And I'm optimistic because I think that there are great opportunities for Google in this process. And the great opportunities will be a clearer rulebook, a clearer set of guidance that allows us, it is not just, from my perspective, about blocking launches and holding services back. What this could be is the opportunity for the clearest set of rules to be in Europe, for the fastest launches to be in Europe. And I think that's a combination of thinking sensibly about what is typically bad, what are the things that are so bad that we want to stop them immediately. And I think it's also a function of creating processes where we can accept that we need to take a closer look and to borrow from Paul's comments, accelerate that analysis. What is it that we need to do? What is it we need to be looking at to make those decisions quickly so that companies can continue to launch products? That's my final comment.
Many thanks for your clear words at the end. And the final word has my co-moderator, Luis. I think you have the pleasure to close the session.
I also remain optimistic that by the end of the year I might be allowed out my spare bedroom back into the world again. I think there are three challenges for the legislators, the Commission in the next couple of months. One is whatever emerges from this, it's got to be, whatever regulatory structure, it's got to be more efficient than these antitrust cases. That's the problem that is trying to be solved. Cases are too slow, they're too burdensome. It has to be more efficient than that. Point two, there has to be some kind of consensus around these harms. As Ollie said, self-preferencing can mean everything or nothing to different people. It's very easy to, for politicians to put out these words which give nice sound bites to journalists like me, but really nailing down what those harms are is going to be difficult. And thirdly, and Andreas raised this point as well, scope is a really big deal. Yeah, there's agreement that GAFA should be the target, But what about gatekeepers beyond that? So people like Booking.com and Airbnb and Uber are concerned about this legislation. You go one circle further out, and you've got people like, residential real estate platforms. If I want to put my house on the market or my flat on the market, there's basically one place to go to in Belgium. That is a gatekeeper as well. How do you legislate for the gaffer guys and at the same time keep those other platforms in mind, whether you want them in or out of scope? So I think they're the three things which will be on the agenda for the next few months.
It was a clear message at the end, and I think I couldn't close better to the session that the way you do, Louis. I really appreciate it. Especially we learned that there are other gatekeepers than GAFA. So now we're going to have a small break and then continue with the second tool of the Commission. That's the new competition tool inspired by the British model.